What I'm about to tell you is what I find myself thinking about the most in terms of failures. What I find myself thinking about the most is that I didn't prioritize my coworkers' well-being over business performance all the time.
The leaders that I work with sometimes have a very difficult time admitting they don't know something. And that goes back to the legacy of their education, because we were punished when we didn't get something right. We were rewarded for getting something right and punished for getting something wrong.
The ones that fail to launch, I would say there's sort of a couple of different vectors of that. One is that, and I would say the most common one is not a failure to execute on product or a failure to sell, but it's that the founders themselves don't have a high fidelity feedback loop between what customers say they want and what they go and build. That either the founder is imagining things that the world might want and building them in anticipation and then being disappointed when they aren't actually what the customer wants.
Welcome to this episode of What If with Leslie Grandy. Coping with, accepting, and rebounding from failure is something most, if not all, successful creative leaders have learned to do. Since our days in school, we've been trained to see failure as evidence of inadequacy. And because there are many flavors of failure, it's easy to spot. A personal failure, a failed project, a failed company, a failing grade. Somewhere along the way, the failure becomes attached to our identity. We start to play it safe, make smaller moves, limit risk, and do everything we can to avoid failure. And in the process, we compress our thinking. We narrow our options, avoid experimentation, and become less willing to challenge assumptions. Ironically, these behaviors often increase the likelihood of failure instead. Over the course of writing my book and through the conversations I've had on this podcast, I've learned that creative leaders talk unapologetically about their close relationship with failure and the role it's played in their success. And that's why I put together this compilation, to share how leaders, founders, and innovators think about failure differently, and how that mindset helps them continue building, adapting, and moving forward when the outcome is uncertain and the assumptions are untested. I've interviewed a lot of leaders, and the leaders whose conversations we revisit in this episode all share this common belief that you need to own and interrogate failure for it to propel success. Most people are trained to reframe it, rebrand it, turn it into a growth story, and move on quickly. In this episode, you'll hear how an investor, executive coach, entrepreneurs, and corporate executives continue to own and understand their failures because of the important lessons they taught. We kick off with Kelly Smith, a former executive at public companies like MGM Resorts, Starbucks, and Haggerty, and who is now an investor and advisor to startups. Most people think failure becomes easier as you become more successful, but for leaders building new products, new companies, and new markets, the stakes actually get higher. So we discuss what happens when failure isn't personal rejection anymore, but part of the innovation process itself.
Failure is actually kind of an interesting word. For example, what if we just take a minute and say, hold on a second, what does it mean exactly? I mean, what's the definition of this word? Because sometimes people conflate it with things didn't turn out the way I expected, right? But what's the technical definition of the word? The technical definition of the word goes all the way back to the days of practically when we can track humans, and it had a literal definition, which was physical, to stumble or trip. And I think what I see in business a lot is that we use the word failure kind of incorrectly almost, which is to say that, because someone couldn't interpret the future, they failed. And I think there's a nuance that's really, really important there, right? You can have an intuition about what the future will support in terms of a startup, and you can sort of do your best to try to triangulate why you think now is the right time and why you think this is going to be the right product that the market's going to react favorably to. But what you can't do is assure your investors that you know the future, right? So what you're looking for is really high quality failures from people where they stumbled and tripped and dealt with that really well. But you're not looking for you should have known, you should have known exactly what 2028 is going to be all about. I don't really fault people for things like that. The failures that stand out to me are ones where I literally knew better. I didn't listen to my intuition. I did it anyway. Right? I didn't need to look into the future. It was something about that moment in time. I knew that I shouldn't have done that. Those failures really bother me. What I'm about to tell you is what I find myself thinking about the most in terms of failures. What I find myself thinking about the most is that I didn't prioritize my coworkers' well-being over business performance all the time. To me, that's a failure that really bothers me. And it didn't require that I knew what was going to happen in the future. There are many situations where I'd go back in time and I'd say, wow, if you could have had both business success and maintained your relationship with this person, had you just, taken a deep breath, or had you just sort of looked at the big picture, or had you remembered what you always tell yourself, which is, this is a finite life we all have, right? Imaging personal relationships over business pursuits is just the stupidest thing. Those are the ones that really weigh on me, kind of even to this day. It's just where I made conduct choices that were far from flattering.
Failure is often something we take personally. We treat the inability to achieve success as a judgment about the person behind the idea rather than the idea itself. But for the people I interviewed for my book and for many of the guests I've spoken with this season, failure isn't rejection, it's information, it's learning, and ultimately it becomes part of the innovation process itself. Marcello Maionchi, Chief Product Officer at Arduino, talked about how he takes pride in his failures because of how he's learned from them. Seeing failure as something you learn from, not run from, is one of Marcello's core beliefs.
I think that, feeling safe and taking a bold leap, I don't think there are two things that can, really coexist. I think that, it's not that you have to feel safe to take a bold leap. You need to be comfortable with, the fact that you can fail because you are, doing something that has done before. And I think that as a leader, as an organization, is, you make people feel safe by simply account for failure in what you do. And just, knowing that if you want to innovate, it might go wrong. It's part of the game. And it's absolutely fine. Of course, as long as, there are two important caveats to this. First, you left no stones unturned, and you don't fail twice because of the same reason. So you learn from your failure. Once you do those two things, I think that failure is just, part of the game. It's accepted. And actually, as a matter of fact, I like to say that I am what I am, mostly because of the failures that I have, because I learned way more from those than from the successes. Well, in a way, I think that for example, I had this kind of, very odd, opportunity in my career, which is the fact that, for three different instances, in three different companies, I got to run the same type of product, right? It was, in a startup, Microsoft, and at Arduino. Three different companies at three different stages, but early stage startup, big, hyperscaler of the cloud, and, mid-size scale-ups. So, and, what I learned there through failure is that if you're building the same product for the same market, depending on the company you are in and the type of goals that you're setting for the type of company that you are, the type of product that you build is different. And as a result, you always need to take in account all the different conditions that are building up your, I would say, off conditions. In a nutshell, failure as a product, builder, right, is usually lack of product market fit. This, I would say, that accounts for, 90% of my job-related failures, right? As I guess, the vast majority of failures of product managers out there. The realization, was that becoming aware that the lack of product market fit was not necessarily caused by either the market or the product, but the market, the product, and the stage of the company.
Kelly Breslin Wright shared that she sold books door to door during the summers in college. And she literally had the door slammed in her face more than once. She got many more no's than yeses, and instead of discouraging her, those moments strengthened her resilience and pushed her even harder toward achieving her goals. Kelly maintains that how people handle dealing with uncertainty or change or unexpected events informs how well they will rebound from failure. And that is not just true for sales folks like Kelly's band. It's insight that applies to almost any role. When you don't allow yourself to see the rejection as failure, you're better positioned to use the learning as fuel to achieve success. You're listening to What If with Leslie Grandy. If you want to activate your imagination and build your creative muscles, I've put together some free resources, including webinars, downloadable content, bonus book content, and even a GPT to help you achieve your goals. Access these free tools to start asking what if today at lesliegrandy.com/resources.
How are we going to build the muscle for resiliency, adaptability, being able to know how to deal with failure, where there is relatively low tolerance for failure in school or in the workplace? How do people actually just handle dealing with uncertainty or change or unexpected events? It comes back again to that muscle of dealing with change, flexibility, adaptability, risk taking, and being able to deal with failure. I think it is pretty well known that oftentimes biggest learnings come from your biggest mistakes or your biggest failures. People intellectually know that. Doesn't mean that they want to go through the failures. But if you're trying to become like a more well-rounded executive or leader or business person, or even in your job, and you're only going to have successes, then you're not going to actually get all of that learning. One contrarian way of thinking about it is if you had a company that are filled with people that have been successful 100% of the time, and none of them have the muscle or experience to work through failure or change. Well, let's separate those. Through failure, or they don't have the resiliency to be able to navigate when times go tough. Like most people aren't going to want those to lead the company, because any company is going to run into fits and starts. You're going to have challenges. I mean, there's no one that's built a company without lots of roller coaster ups and downs. And you need to have people that know how to handle and navigate through those hard times. You need to have people who are willing and able to take risks, because that's how you're going to have disruptive transformational change. And you also need to have people who can manage other people in a way where when the going gets tough, or when people have a challenge or people fall down, to get people back up, because it's just not realistic that everything's going to go right all of the time.
Failing to know all the answers as a leader is only a failure when you believe you should know everything. Likewise, if you believe that getting something wrong is worthy of punishment, you squash employees' willingness to take even intelligent risks and experiment. Like Kelly, Chuck Garcia, who's an executive coach and who built a career years ago as a Wall Street executive, believes that leaders who seek perfection, whether for themselves or for their teams, are pursuing the wrong goal.
The leaders that I work with sometimes have a very difficult time admitting they don't know something. And that goes back to the legacy of their education, because we were punished when we didn't get something right. We were rewarded for getting something right and punished for getting something wrong. So here's the crazy thing. That vulnerability they feel is a weakness, but it gets them into a whole lot of trouble when they're not vulnerable. So it starts with the admission, because all of us are capable of doing anything, but we can't everything. Just the admission of not knowing what you don't know is a beautiful thing, because it keeps you from causing any further self-inflicted harm. This is where they get into trouble. And sometimes just the simple admission, I don't know, but I'll find out where. Such a simple thing, but some people have a very difficult time, especially the control freaks. They have a hard time letting go and accepting the fact that they're not perfect.
Normalizing failure can feel dangerous to some leaders. They worry it lowers standards or undermines the pursuit of high performance. But that logic breaks down in dynamic environments where change is constant and ambiguity is everywhere. Because if uncertainty, experimentation, and possible failure are unavoidable, then the real differentiator isn't avoiding failure altogether. It's developing the mindset to move toward uncertainty while everyone else waits for proof. Sean Atkins is the CEO of Darman Studios. After a successful career in digital media, he suggests the risk of failure is an integral part of building a disruptive business and working in emerging markets.
I'd rather be with a great team that failed than a mediocre team that succeeded, because it's just from a human experience, it's like struggle with people and getting to the other side with your differences and your pains is a better experience in my, right? Better learning for me, better growth for me as a leader. Those are sort of, you and I know, having pretty long experience, those are hard to come by, right? Like I tell people, it's like, there's not actually a correlation to my happiness and my success, right? There's like teams I've had where we didn't succeed. I love them. Like I'd go through glass for them tomorrow. There's teams where we had success and we don't really talk to each other. So those aren't necessarily the same thing. I think the other thing is, because I have done this enough times, I have built the political savvy to help teams who don't have the maturity of career that I have to navigate those things with a better chance of success. And even at the 2%, 3%, 4% marginal chance in those sort of failure rates, it's a big difference. And so And I had to learn this. People are still afraid to take risks no matter how much you encourage them. I stood up on our all hands in December, and mostly what I talked about were things we did that did not work, hopefully to try and create an impression. Everybody's still here. By the way, here's what we learned.
Learning from failure is different than just accepting it happened. And the people who have seen hundreds of ideas, founders, and companies succeed or collapse have learned that failure leaves patterns, and it raises more questions than answers. What if we'd made different assumptions? What if the outcome I thought represented success came with unexpected consequences? Investor Chris DeVore has seen his share of successes and failures, and over time he's become skilled at diagnosing whether an entrepreneur has the mindset to adjust to setbacks and feedback. Because passion can create blind spots, and it can undermine the path to success.
I have a very rich mental database of patterns of success and failure, some of which are industry-based, some of which are product or execution-based, and some of which are really interpersonal dynamics and how founders interact. So we can take those in any direction you want, but it's hard for me to distill down one nugget because there's so much learning, essentially hard knocks or mistake-based learning, which is the way that I learn best is by trying things and seeing what happens and not just, reading about it or theorizing about it. So I have lots and lots of stories to tell about why things tend to go off the rails and if they don't, why they tend to steer into a more productive kind of incrementally compounding journey to being a real business. So a lot of the work in our partnership is that sort of post-mortem or unfolding, like even if the company's not dead yet, to really kind of diagnose like what's not working. If you interact with a founder, which we often do every week or every 2 weeks on their journey, and you often ask the same set of questions, which is like, what's working, what's not working, how can we help, where are you stuck? You start listening for the same things over and over. And I think the ones that fail to launch, I would say there's sort of a couple of different vectors of that. One is that, and I would say the most common one is not a failure to execute on product or a failure to sell, but it's that the founders themselves don't have a high fidelity feedback loop between what customers say they want and what they go and build. That either the founder is imagining things that the world might want and building them in anticipation and then being disappointed when they aren't actually what the customer wants, or they build something that they think is what the customer wants. They give it to the customer and the customer says, oh, that's close, but it's not quite it. And they can't, it's the fidelity and speed with which you listen and learn and iterate that gets you to good. And something about that cycle is broken. And I would say more often than not, it's not the customer's fault. It's the founder or the founding team's fault. Failure to listen, a failure to apply what they're learning, and a stubbornness about wanting their vision to be what the world gets instead of what the customer actually says they want. It's breakdowns in that chain of listening, learning, and iteration and execution that tend to cause things to get gummed up and companies to fail to progress. So there's these sort of moments or increments of failure that cause people to fall out as founders. But I do think it's really not it was a bad idea. It's almost always this human or set of humans had the wrong temperament to be effective, because no business is right. No product is right in its first instance. You've experienced that yourself, right? It's always incremental, and it's that the failure to get it right, not in the first instance, but to build a mechanism to get it progressively righter on a short cycle. That's the thing that's really hard to do, because it does require this weird combination of skills and attributes that many people, even if they excel on one vector, they fall short on the others. This gets into the math of startups and venture economics, which is most startups fail for lots of reasons that are not about technology, whatever, competition, market dynamics, overcapitalization. Assume failure. A very small number are going to make it. You're going to lose a lot of money on all the ones that don't work. The ones that work have to work at such a scale that you pay for all of the risk of the failed ones and generate enough return to justify the illiquidity and the risk capital that you've put to work.
The most interesting thing about failure is how we respond to it. That moment reveals what we're made of, how resilient we are, how willing we are to learn from mistakes, and how open we are to turning the lesson into fuel for moving forward, even if it means resetting the goal entirely. Every person in this episode is accomplished and self-aware, and not one of them failed because they lacked ideas or passion. More often, the failure stemmed from missing a pattern, failing to ask the right questions, holding assumptions too tightly, or blindly trusting one's intuition without recognizing biases. And sometimes expertise itself becomes part of the risk. Authority can make it harder for others to question the plan, challenge the strategy, or point out vulnerabilities before they become consequences. But the people who continue to grow, adapt, and innovate are usually the ones willing to examine failure honestly instead of defensively. They stay curious long enough to understand what went wrong and humble enough to let that understanding change how they think, decide, and lead going forward. Because failure is most productive when it sharpens judgment instead of diminishing confidence.
Thank you for listening to What If with Leslie Grandy. If you're interested in learning more about creative leadership, or you're just looking for a way to build your creative self-confidence and agency, check out my book, Creative Velocity, at lesliegrandy.com/book and start turning your ideas into action.